Hey everybody, my name is Brendan Noble, author of the Frostmarked Chronicles, which is my fantasy series based on Slavic mythology. This week, I'm taking Slavic Saturday to talk about that book series and the first book in the series, A Dagger in the Winds, because we are just 3 days from the release of A Dagger in the Winds. I've been talking about this book for over a year now, and finally, I'm so excited to be able to be releasing it to all of you to finally be able to enjoy. So today, I want to introduce you to the two main characters in the book, Vatswav and Otilia, and kind of get to introduce you to them, get to know their backstory and what their kind of motivations are throughout the story. And if you're interested in Slavic mythology and the series in general, you can get the prequel novella, The Rider in the Night, for free by joining my newsletter down below. It is a non-spammy newsletter, gets sent out once a month besides around the releases, and it gets a little bit more frequent. But you'll be able to receive that novella for free, and you can also get exclusive insights into Dagger in the Winds and the rest of the series. There's also pre-orders going on that you can check out down below. Right now, if you pre-order a hardcover copy of A Dagger in the Winds from my store specifically, you'll also get a free paperback copy of The Rider in the Night as well. There's also many other stores you can pre-order from down below as well. But now let's dive into talking more about Vatswav and Otilia. The photos you also see throughout this video were taken for a photo shoot we got to do with two actors for playing Vatswav and Otilia. It was a fun little thing. I'll post some links down to the photographer below if you want to see more of her work as well. So the first of our two main characters is Vatswav, who I describe as caring, hesitant, and desperate for a purpose. Vatswav finds himself as kind of an interesting position within the tribe of Krovik, which is kind of the main tribe that takes place during the story. He is the son, or the second-born son of the high chief of the tribe, but instead of being born to the chiefess, he is born to a secondary wife called a concubine. And around his birth, him and his mother were sent away by the chiefess because she didn't like the competition that the concubine, whose name is Lubina, provided. And so Vatswav had to grow up alone with his mother outside of the tribe's main walls of the village called Dvizheki. And this kind of puts him in a really odd position where he's the son of a high chief, but he really doesn't have the position of being the son of the high chief. To make his kind of situation even weirder, he also has this thing that occurs every night. When he falls asleep, his soul rises from his body and he's allowed to wander the world, or at least the village around where he sleeps, invisible to anyone who could interact with, which is kind of odd. He has had this in his entire life and he has no idea why. And it just kind of adds to this isolation he feels because he spends these 7 to 8 hours a night alone. Despite this isolation, he did have one especially close friend growing up, and that is the aspiring sorceress Otilia. Before their 12th birthday, both of them were known to travel the woods together, exploring around the village, and trying to get into a little bit of trouble, but not too much trouble. And so the two of them have this kind of interesting relationship where her father is the high priest of the tribe, High Priest Darius, and he is the kind of has a rivalry with High Chief Jacek, which is Vatswav's father. And so their fathers really don't approve of them meeting up and being together and being friends. And this kind of comes to a head on the eve of the spring equinox when both of them were 12 years old. Otilia was a couple moons before becoming a sorceress called a Sheptuha, which is a channeler who can get chosen by a specific god or goddess and can channel their powers. And so being able to do sorcery before that would be considered witchcraft typically. So on the eve of the spring equinox, Vatswav and Otilia were attacked by a band of wolves. And Vatswav tried to fight them off, but he was 12 years old. He only was just learning how to use a spear and could do very little about it. He was getting torn apart. And just as he thought he was probably going to die, Otilia managed to channel some type of magic and kill all of the wolves. When Vatswav's father heard about the story, he forbid Vatswav from ever seeing Otilia again. But Vatswav had her as his only friend, so he went anyway. Unfortunately, Jacek discovered it in the end, and Vatswav was beaten and threatened that Jacek would exile Otilia if Vatswav ever saw her again. So he turned his back on her, something that Otilia never knew the reason why. 4 years later, Vatswav has trained a little bit with a general whose name was Kobas, and he's learned how to fight. He's kind of tried to make a little bit of his name for himself, but he's been mocked as being called the half-chief because he's the son of a concubine. And he's really just desperate to try to find a way to prove himself to both his friends and the tribe. This is now 4 years later, exactly on the spring equinox, and he's supposed to jump the fire and be declared an adult. And he's trying to figure out what that means for him. And when interesting situations occur that I won't spoil, and the goddess Marzana gives him an offer of a purpose, it turns out to be too tempting for him to reject. The dark truth about Marzana's actual offer, though, soon are revealed, and Vatswav will realize that only one person can help him figure out the truth, and that's his old friend Otilia. And the quote I pulled from Vatswav's chapters early on is, "A small dagger lay buried in the snow. Its hilt was black as the night, and a leather sheath covered its blade. When I picked it up, the cool metal hummed in my hand as I drew it and gasped. The flat of the dark blade crackled as icy white designs etched themselves into its surface, forming a set of symbols I didn't recognize. Her tongue had no written word, but a whisper in my mind told me their meaning. Blood." And this quote gives a little bit of a hint into the dark part of the magic involved in the story, and particularly Marzana's magic, that you'll have to learn about more by reading. Some of the most fun aspects of writing Vatswav are this kind of innately human aspect of there's so much going on in his life that he feels is beyond his control, and he just wants to be able to prove himself and finally have this kind of aspect of control in his life. But with all the things going around him, Vatswav is still a very innately caring person. He thinks very thoroughly about everything he does, typically. And this means that he struggles with what to decide, especially when there's ramifications for a lot of his actions. And that's very fun because you get to dive into a little bit of the aspects of especially the different approach that you'll see that Otilia takes versus him, and how he can very much care about things around him and people around him, even though he has his own struggles as well. So we've talked a little bit about Vatswav's backstory, which involves Otilia as well, as her being the daughter of the high priest and his kind of domineering presence in her life. She was much closer with her mother, but unfortunately, around that 12th birthday in the spring equinox, when Vatswav turned his back on her, and she never really understood why. She knew it probably had something to do with what she channeled that day, but she was already trying to question so much about her life, and to lose her best and really only friend at the time was a really tragic thing. To make matters worse, her mother died just weeks after this event, when what is called an illness called Marzana's curse took her, and Otilia really never managed to recover. She's mourned for years after her mother's death because she was so close with her. And though she became a Sheptuha, being chosen by Jivana, the goddess of the wilds and hunt, and being the first Sheptuha for Jivana, but also being chosen by Makash, who's the goddess of divination and women, and being able to serve these goddesses kind of filled this hole in her life, and she's devoted herself to channeling their power to protect the wilds and serve them as needed. But 4 years later, again, she is also going to be jumping the fire and being declared an adult, but she doesn't really know what she wants besides just serving them. She's been considered a witch her entire life because so many in the tribe doubt, especially her type of channeling, with her being the only channeler of the wild goddess. People doubt that, and she's kind of been ostracized as this witch. And because of this bond she has of Jivana and the relationships that she's had and lost, I describe her very much as this determined, untamed, very much like the wilds, but in the end, very alone. And this is a thing that she has to wrestle with, but because she's kind of built this shielding up around her, she's not willing to let herself be vulnerable to other people because of the things that have happened to her and who she's lost in her life. She's kind of, again, accepted this isolation and sometimes started to believe some of the lies people talk about her, like calling her a witch, and potentially she thinks she might not actually be that good. When Malkosh shows her a vision of what may come on the spring equinox, though, she starts to realize that maybe there's more than just being called the witch around the village. But she's going to try to make a change. She realizes how important Vatswav is and what potentially could happen. And the quote I've pulled for Otilia that I think describes her pretty well is this: The woods were a rare haven. They were Jivana's realm, untouched by the corrupting hand of man. As far as I knew, she had never chosen a Sheptuha before me. That made serving her lonely, but I liked it that way. So writing Otilia was probably actually my favorite character to create. She is such an interesting kind of challenge to build, but because of her complex backstory. But she's also just fierce, really sometimes aggressive, but also a very passionate person, and how she serves the goddesses and what she's willing to do to accomplish her tasks. It's a really fun contrast to Vatswav, who's sometimes the more hesitant and very thoughtful way of approaching things. And that way it makes them very fun to interact together, because they kind of have this quippiness back and forth, because they have so much history as well between the two characters. And I really look forward to seeing you being allowed to show you guys how their story plays out. And so those are our two main characters for the story. There's plenty of other side characters as well that you'll get to meet throughout the stories. I hope you enjoyed hearing about a little bit about Vatswav and Otilia, and I hope you enjoy being able to read A Dagger in the Winds as well, coming out in 3 days on June 15th. Slavic Saturday will return next week as well, so if you're looking forward to talking more about dragons, I can tell you that we'll have got one more at least in that series, so stay tuned.